Sometimes people ask me if I'm a pacifist, and I say no. Uh, Pacifism, to me, is not the same as nonviolence. Let me show you a little diagram to illustrate what I do think and how I sort these words out for myself. I'm going to share my screen with you, show you a very simple diagram. So, to my understanding, a pacifist is a person who commits themselves to actions that are not violent all the time, and they don't allow themselves to be violent under any circumstances, whatever the justification. Now, in the world, there's a lot of violence, but I think it's helpful to distinguish between violence that's necessary and violence that's unnecessary. The job of nonviolence is to reduce the unnecessary violence and to shrink this region in the middle as much as possible. But let me say a little bit about necessary and unnecessary violence. Both Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King gave examples in which violence was acceptable in situations of self-defense, to protect oneself or to protect your family or the community. And so here are the icons of nonviolence, allowing that there are some situations in which violence is your only option. And I recognize that too. There are some very dramatic examples of necessary violence. We can go back to 9/11, and I'm thinking particularly of Flight 93, which was a hijacked aircraft that was brought down and crashed by a revolt of passengers on board that plane. They would not allow the hijackers to complete their mission, which apparently was to crash that plane into buildings in Washington, D.C., possibly resulting in the deaths of hundreds of people and a great disruption to the government. The crash of Flight 93 took the lives of 44 people. So they died violent deaths by choice. They entered into necessary violence in order to achieve something, to achieve an important goal. I'd like to think that I would be willing to engage in necessary violence under circumstances that called for it. I don't know, until the situation arises, nobody ever knows. But I think being prepared with the right set of problem-solving skills and ethical principles is desirable, because you may face that challenge someday. Let's see. Let's talk about unnecessary violence. Most types of unnecessary violence arise from some form of disrespect or from the inability of a person who's been disrespected to handle those feelings. So think about bullies, and then think about people who have been bullied and how they sometimes retaliate. Many of the school shooters that we hear about in the United States seem to be in that category. A lot of unnecessary violence is retaliatory in nature. One person feels disrespected, and so they use violence as a way of getting revenge. And that sets up these cycles of unnecessary violence, where hostility and harm feed on themselves and continue. One of the goals of nonviolence is to break those cycles, because then we can prevent a lot of that violence that goes back and forth in a retaliatory tit for tat fashion. Sabotage of workers by their fellow workers in the workplace is all too common. Violence that is based on power differentials, like doctors bullying nurses, and then nurses taking it out on the CNAs, and CNAs taking it out on orderlies if the system still has orderlies. That's all too common. It is under trained in medical schools and nursing schools, uh, in police academies, in other places where people have power over others. And an important part of one's education in those situations is to avoid the abuse of power in a violent way. Of course, as a person influenced by Martin Luther King, I include internal violence as well as external violence in what I'm talking about here. Martin Luther King said that a lot of violence starts inside the person, and it's in the form of resentments and jealousies and hatreds that eat away at a person, so that the first person who's harmed by that violence is the person who harbors those feelings. But then when it's acted out violently toward other people, we see it. And it's like an explosion that spreads from one person to another. Um, let's see, punishment, as we see it in our criminal justice system, is often a form of violence. We lock people up because they have annoyed us, not because uh, not because the punishment is designed to rehabilitate the person. It's just meant to take them off the street and get them out of our sight. But what happens as a result is that prisons become universities for crime, and for violent crime in particular. We create violent individuals unnecessarily through the way our criminal justice system is set up. Beliefs. Some people believe that violence is okay, and their personal ideology primes them to use violence as a first resort rather than a last resort when they come into conflict with others. Um, that feels like a failure of education to me. And again, I think learning about nonviolence, and in my case, I believe that that marries very well with learning about human psychology. That's a way in which unnecessary violence can be reduced. We have lots of evidence that unnecessary violence can be reduced. There are programs like peer mediation programs in schools, like progressive approaches to rehabilitation of juvenile offenders, which is a field that I've been involved in. Uh, in general, approaches that respect the person and offer them resources and help to become nonviolent can reduce a lot of unnecessary violence. And that's what we're up to. That's what this channel is about. The channel is called Learning Nonviolence. And the reason we want to learn nonviolence is so that we can address this problem, reducing unnecessary violence. If we're going to have violence in the world, let it be restricted to necessary violence. And that brings up the concept of thresholds for violence. One of the problems that is probably central to the human condition is that our threshold for engaging in violence is too low. We engage in violence when it's unnecessary, often because we don't know any alternatives, any other way to go, and we find it hard to restrain ourselves. So we become violent in a way that it reminds you of the fable about uh, the boy who cried wolf, and he cried wolf when there was no wolf, and then when the time came to really confront a wolf for real, nobody believed him, and they were unprepared. We need to change our attitude toward both unnecessary violence and necessary violence. The way to do this is through education, I believe. So the videos on this channel are aimed, each video contains at least one good idea, I think. And it's a serious attempt to build up our repertoire for doing that job of reducing unnecessary violence. For me, that repertoire has been fed by engaging in work with people of the civil rights movement, people who worked with Dr. King and their successors, and by being a psychologist. I've found that psychology provides a lot of support for the things that Martin Luther King taught his followers to do. And I think in his day, a lot of his followers did what he said because of who he was. He appeared to be the Moses who was promised to lead his people out of bondage and into a different world of freedom. I think in the absence of Dr. King, in the absence of doing it because an admired person tells you to do it, I think we need to come to a place where we engage in these practices, use these skills because of a deep understanding of human nature and a valuing of nonviolent skills, because they are the best way to live in a world with other people, and to implement the idea that, other people are like me. They're humans. They're cool in the ways that I think I'm cool. And it's part of my responsibility and privilege to take care of them and not to do harm to them, because then I'll be living in a less violent world, and that's good for me. So I'm interested in what people think about these ideas and this way of framing the role of nonviolence and learning nonviolence, and also the place of pacifism in the vocabulary that we use sometimes when we're trying not to be violent. I invite comments.